Our next session is going to be with Jonathan Pennington. I locked onto Jonathan Pennington, a New Testament scholar, via a chapter that he wrote in a book in 2008 on the whole book was Creation and Cosmology. And so Jonathan himself wrote the chapter on cosmology in Matthew's Gospel. And I sort of thought, well, you know, given that Genesis will sort of tend to preside in my presentation a little bit, Matthew might be an interesting spot to start in looking at creation in the New Testament. I wanted to open our minds to the idea that actually, to some degree, each book of the New Testament will have some kind of creation theology built in somewhere. Each of the Gospels does. And I thought, let's get a Matthew specialist to just think about how creation ideas begin to find their birth in Matthew, as a way of getting you to think, oh, I should actually, if I want to look at this theme, have an eye open for it in each book of the Bible that I'm reading. So he did his studies in the UK and was involved with Tyndale over there. He's now at Southern Seminary or Southern Baptist Seminary in Kentucky, USA. And his own research interests have moved in the direction of well-being, and he's also written on Jesus as a wisdom teacher and a few books like that. Okay, so let's roll. Let me formally introduce Dr. Jonathan Pennington. Jonathan has studied at a fairly well-known school in the US, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and also at University of St Andrews in the UK, and is now at Southern Baptist Seminary, Southern Seminary.
We say it both ways.
And what's your exact position again, Jonathan?
I'm a professor of New Testament there, and I for a long time ran our PhD program here as well, but I also in more recent years stepped away from that so I could take a larger role at my church. So I preach about a third of the time and run the men's ministry and do a lot of counseling and lots of other church stuff as well, which I enjoy a lot too. So
I've noticed that you have a counseling ministry, Human Flourishing Ministries. So does that come under the umbrella of the church, or is it your own kind of separate enterprise?
A little bit of both, probably. I mean, I do work for the church. The Human Flourishing Ministries, I do a lot of traveling and speaking as well as consulting with churches on various things. And it just kind of, it's easier to incorporate it as like a separate ministry. And
you have a kind of a media presence as well. There's a blog, Cars, Coffee, Theology.
Yeah, it's been a little while. COVID kind of killed that because it wasn't real kosher to drive around close quarters with the cars. And that sports car, that was my midlife crisis. Sports car died finally, so it's kind of dead for now. But maybe eventually. It was a ton of fun. I think we had 23 episodes where I just got to talk to friends about their academic books. It was a ton of fun. Yeah.
Coffee, theology, and social distancing.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't quite work as well. Yeah.
So would you like to tell us a little bit more, Jonathan, about your research path and your personal development as a Christian thinker?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Of course, I'll try to do a short version of it, but yeah, had a great experience at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and through the influence of several professors there, I ended up getting to go to Scotland and study with Richard Bauckham, which is a great honor, and really wonderful years when I was there with a bunch of other people who were just trying to figure out, especially before there was such a thing as what came to be called theological interpretation of Scripture. But before that was kind of a thing, it was like, we're trying to figure out, how do you think about the Bible theologically, and the Bible and academic study the Bible, even within the history of the church and all that. So those were exciting years for that. But my research, particularly in those days, was on the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm so thankful for that, because I went in mostly approaching Matthew from a perspective of Second Temple apocalyptic literature. And so, as you know, around kind of at the end of it, Sean McDonough, who's another former student of Richard Bauckham's, we did this little volume on cosmology and New Testament theology, because my dissertation, my thesis, was related to heaven and earth language in Matthew. So that was, I learned a ton. But what I did not expect to happen was that I really, as I finished that and then began teaching the Gospels mostly, really fell in love with the Gospels as literature and as theology. And so that wasn't completely absent in my thesis work, but it became more a big part of what I do. And so I've written a number of books related to reading the Gospels as literature and as theology, and then particularly the Sermon on the Mount became a big focus, which happens sometimes to Matthew scholars, rightly so. And then that led one kind of thing to another, to thinking a lot about the intersection of Christianity with this idea of true human flourishing, which is this ancient human and universal human question. And that led me to think a lot about the Greco-Roman backgrounds to the Gospels, and Jesus as a philosopher of the good life. And so a lot of my work kind of centers around that now. There was a former part of my life I forgot about even telling this, that I did a lot of Greek things related to teaching and interpreting Greek and the middle voice systems. There was all that too. That was another part of my past. So yeah, so those are a number of things I do. And then also integrating it, because I do care about the church and church life, I'm always trying to integrate biblical studies with church life and preaching as well. So.
Did the interest in human flourishing grow out of your Matthew studies then, or was that something that was already alive?
No, it did very much. I guess I've always liked to flourish as a human, but as an academic study, yeah, I often have told the story, I'll keep it brief here, is that I started teaching a class on the Sermon on the Mount just because I saw it in the course catalog and I needed some extra money. It was like 15 years ago or so. It's like, you could teach these overload courses. I was the guy with the PhD in Matthew, thought, well, I could teach Sermon on the Mount. And I very quickly realized I was way in over my head. Like I just assumed the Sermon on the Mount was some of the chapters in Matthew, and quickly came to realize that it was, the single most studied, preached upon, commented upon, single most influential portion of the New Testament for centuries, probably throughout the whole church's history. It's like a greatest hits of many of Jesus' teachings. I've described it as like if Taylor Swift and the Beatles and the Eagles put a greatest hits combo album, double, triple album together, it's all in there, whatever. And it also, spins off into so many huge theological issues of ethics and what is the relationship of Torah to the new covenant, all these things. And so I quickly realized I was in over my head and started to read voraciously, and quickly realized that from an ethical perspective, I really believe in a virtue ethics understanding, and started to try to read the Sermon on the Mount through a virtue ethics thing as a Protestant, and really stumbled upon all this stuff about human flourishing. And then that's been a huge part of what I've done for the last 15 years. I'm very thankful. It's changed my personal life. It's not only an academic thing. It's like had a pretty significant impact on how I think about theology and my relationship with God as well.
That's really what good thinking is meant to do, isn't it? It's not meant to be cordoned off and unrelated to life. Especially for the Christian believer, it should really be life-changing. And so that means that the Christian academic really can't anticipate where their path is going to go and how it's going to change them. We really can't see that at the start. The reason for inviting you, Jonathan, is to tap into your thoughts about the creation theme and the cosmology of Matthew as a kind of an entry point, almost a symbolic invitation to consider the whole creation of the New Testament by saying, well, it's the first book of the Testament, and just as Genesis often occupies the attention to a fair degree for creation theology in the Old Testament, perhaps not everyone in our audience and our viewership will have thought about the New Testament in the same way and thought, oh, we could even go to an individual gospel or an individual letter of Paul and ask what its creation theology is. So if we, for those purposes, take on Matthew as our focus for this session and ask about its creation theology, that might be news to some viewers that, in fact, Matthew has a creation theology. If that was a brand new thought for someone, how would you introduce them to the idea?
Yeah, I think we might be disappointed if we're looking for a ton of explanation of like environmental issues and other things that are right to care about as we think about creation theology. But I think, taking Matthew on his own terms, as you well know, probably, the very first words of Matthew, so the first two words in Greek of the New Testament canonically are book of Genesis. Literally it says biblos genesos, which we translate as the record of the genealogy, which is a fine translation, but there is clearly an intentional riffing on what is the Greek title of the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, as well as what we call the Toledot formula, which is these phrases of "these are the generations of," which really marks both the first and last books of the Hebrew Scriptures. As you well know, that is not in our English canonical order, but in our Hebrew Bibles. Genesis, the first 11 chapters, are all about genealogies and begettings, culminating in the story of Abraham, which really, ends the primordial history and starts the new. But Genesis 11, of course, the table of nations. And then the last book of the Hebrew Bible, we would just be the one book of Chronicles, as I believe it's the first 7 chapters are basically, I think it is, are all genealogy for the post-exilic, the return, as the Jewish people are trying to figure out who's from the Aaronic tribe, who's from the Davidic tribe, and whatever. And so right from the beginning of the New Testament, you see Matthew tapping into the history of Israel, and that being very much centered in this idea of the book of Genesis, and then it being the foundation of all that happens. So, but he's thinking about Genesis and what all the implications of that are.
Once we look closely at the Gospels, we see that each of the Gospels do this in some way, back reference to Genesis, and kind of bring it in and present themselves as the new covenant counterpart of the old covenant from creation on. What would you say are some aspects of Matthew's unique presentation of creation? How does Matthew present the arrival and ministry of Christ in connection with creation? Is there a link between those two concepts?
I think one of the things that many people have noticed about Matthew in particular is that he really, really likes the word heaven, the word urnos. And that's exactly how I kind of stumbled onto Matthew. I guess I didn't share this part of it. The only reason I studied Matthew, I thought I was going to do a PhD in 2 Corinthians. And this is in the late 90s when Paul and the law and all that was still the hot thing. And actually, I think what I was actually interested in was not that, but was the Greek word parrhesia, which means kind of boldness or frankness of speech. So I had all these plans to do a PhD in 2 Corinthians, but I was teaching Greek at Trinity, and I noticed that in the Wenham, I don't know if you guys use that as an old classic English textbook for Greek, it listed the word urnos, heaven, and said something about how in Matthew it's usually plural. It's just like a one-off little comment, right? I thought, that's weird. So I did a little look and I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, not only does Matthew have way more instances of the word heaven than I guess probably any other book, 30% of all of the New Testament's occurrences of urnos occur in Matthew alone, 30% of them. He's about the only one that uses the plural. And so I began to wonder what's going on, because this does seem to be something that he cares a lot about as a theme, and then maybe something more going on. That's what I eventually studied in Matthew. And after working on it for a year or so, sitting in the library in Scotland, like cat on a keyboard trying to figure stuff out and kind of freaking out, like as you do as a first year PhD student, like, do I have something to say here or not? And I began to look at all the Second Temple literature and all how they used heaven. What dawned on me sometime in was, oh, this isn't just about heaven in the Gospel of Matthew. It's actually about heaven and earth, because he uses both of those words a lot, but he especially pairs them together. And if you start thinking about passages in Matthew or texts in Matthew where heaven and earth are together, there are a lot, often in contrastive pairs. So do not lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but lay them up in heaven. That's Matthew 6:19-21. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, in both chapter 16 and chapter 18. Lots of other examples, all the way down to the Great Commission, this culminating image in the Gospel of Matthew. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And so it's one of those things I often call the red Volvo syndrome. It's like, once you decide you're going to buy a red Volvo or whatever car it is, then you start seeing that car everywhere. And like, once you start paying attention to heaven and earth language in Matthew, you're like, wow, it's there a lot. And so this led me, a few years of writing on this or whatever, to eventually argue that heaven and earth in Matthew is actually a pretty key literary and theological theme, and that it explains a lot of what's going on in Matthew's theology, Matthew alone uses the phrase, "He basileia tono or known," the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of the heavens, in plural there, tono or known, which where the other evangelists and most of the rest of the New Testament use the kingdom of God, actually, and clearly parallel passages. So there's been a lot of debate in scholarship. Is this something different? So that's been one of the ongoing things in Matthew. What's going on with the kingdom of heaven? And I argued that that's actually part of this larger heaven and earth theme in Matthew. And so on the one hand, it is cosmological, right? It is about creation, because after all, it's using the language of literally the first verse of the Old Testament. Barashit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then that same heaven and earth thread is pulled through the Old Testament. And what I argued is that it actually functions the same way. Sometimes you use heaven and earth together to refer to all of creation as the whole by Hendiadys, so you're using two opposites to say one thing. But a lot of times heaven and earth end up being contrasted in the Old Testament. So as far as the heavens are above the earth, so are the Lord's ways and wisdom more than humanity's, or our sins removed for us. There's a lot of heaven and earth contrast, especially in the book of Daniel, which turns out to be a really important book for Matthew. So all that to say, I think when you look at Matthew, you see that he's using cosmological language. He's using creational language that is rooted in the core book of Genesis and beyond, but he's using it for a very particular theological purpose. And I think his theological purpose, so his Weltbild is a Weltanschauung, that is, his picture of the world is like a worldview. And what that picture of the world is, and what that worldview is that the relationship of God to humanity can be fundamentally described on a tensive axis as heaven versus earth. Not that God's versus us, but that humanity and God do kingdom and do rule very, very differently. And they view the world very differently. And what is happening in the incarnation, God with us, Emmanuel, in Jesus, he is the one who has the authority. He brings together through the incarnation heaven and earth in that sense. And in himself as God incarnate, and in his obedient life and his teachings and his suffering, his death, and his resurrection, ascension, and eventually session, this creates a new covenant, a new way for heaven and earth to actually relate to each other. And that to enter into the kingdom of heaven is to enter into a discipleship relationship with the one who's sent from heaven and has returned there. So his embodiment and his life really does reunites the spaces of heaven and earth as we long for and look for. The final end of the prophetic hope is that heaven and earth will be reunited, and that Matthew's using this cosmological language to make that theological point. So again, I care about creation, care all those things as well. You're not going to find as much of that in the creation theology of Matthew, but he has a very powerful theological point that does have implications beyond what he's saying for the valuing of creation. Because the gospel message of Matthew is not that Jesus came to rescue us from earth. It is that in the incarnation, he brings the kingdom of heaven to earth. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say, and I'll let you jump in, sorry. The Lord's Prayer, which is obviously not only central to Christian liturgy and practice, but is literally the middle of the middle of the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, like this huge thing. It is truly the center of the center of the center. At the core of the Lord's Prayer is the same heaven and earth language. And that the three initial petitions that are overlapping with each other, that God's name would be honored and hallowed, that his will be done, his kingdom come, those things that are currently in heaven are being asked to come on earth. As these things are in heaven, let them so be on earth. And that really is, again, at the core of Matthew's theology, that it's through Jesus that the heavenly realities can become the earthly realities as well. Not the obliteration of the earth, but the reuniting of the two realms that are separated now, and that only occurs through Jesus.
That's terrific. I can imagine that maybe diligent readers have read the Gospel of Matthew, and sometimes will have read on to Mark and have felt like they were reading some of the same things again, and then maybe Luke and reading some more of the same things. And some will have wondered, what's the relevance of having three Gospels that are so similar? I imagine it would be a bit of an eye-opener to realize that using much of the same original content as Mark, the Gospel of Matthew is capable of being so distinctive in its message to have an integrated theological program unfolding to the extent that it actually involves the wording of the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount. So it's really quite distinctive despite using some common material.
Yeah, I agree. I've been studying Matthew and teaching it, scores of times every year for almost 3 decades. And including this past weekend, I did 16 hours of lectures in a hybrid modular on Matthew, and I learned something new every time. I mean, it's truly treasures. The scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, as he says esoterically in the end of chapter 13, is one who brings out of the treasure house the old and new. And I continue to be in awe of the literary and theological masterpiece that Matthew is.
Yeah, so this is the terrific thing, even when we're looking at biblical books that have a close parallel somewhere else in the canon, we discover that something very original and distinct is being done in each of those books. And just to touch on this point about theory versus application, it actually is a vital prior step to establishing an ethic and a program for what we want to do with things like creation care, that we really have to do this biblical and theological work first if we're to avoid being just reactive and kind of instinctive in our addressing of current issues. We have to do this work, I think, of establishing what our theology is and be patient about reaching that stage of the specifics of a program. So that's something we don't need to be ashamed about at all. There's something distinctive there in Matthew that you point to in this particular chapter that appears in that volume that you showed us before, where Matthew uses a unique word. Maybe you would like to offer us your own working translation of that word and tell us about what it's doing there in its context and in Matthew's program.
Yeah, palingenesia means Genesis again, not that we don't want to overly read it literalistically, but that's the origins of it in that sense. It only occurs, I believe, twice in the New Testament. It's in Matthew 19:28, I think. And the context of it is the very famous story of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus, and because of his love for money being greater than his ability to see the riches of the treasure of heaven, he doesn't enter the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples' response is so classically beautiful. Peter, who is just the most beloved, wholehearted, and misstepping character, a great model for discipleship, says, "Well, we've left everything. What's for us?" And instead of rebuking him for his arrogance or something, or his self-centeredness, Jesus says, "That's right." And he affirms that that's true. And he says, in the palingenesia, in the new Genesis or new creation, renewal of all things. It probably varies somewhat in different English translations. Because it's a rare word, that you apostles, disciples, will sit on 12 thrones judging or ruling over Israel, and then anyone who is given up will receive more. So this ends up being really one of the core ways that the New Testament's eschatology or hope orientation is. There is a reality of rewards. There's a mystery about what that means. Obviously, we don't relate to God in a mechanistic kind of mercenary way that I do this and then I get this. But we also don't operate in a Kantian altruism in the sense that that there is a promise of reward, and that's okay. The way that's described is in a new era, a new age, which can be described as a renewal of all things, but the Genesis part is there, right? And that's part of the tapping back into the story of Genesis and the hope, and of course looking forward canonically to the book of Revelation, where once again the final couple chapters of the New Testament depict the final state, not again as a disembodied heavenly existence, but as a renewal of the earth in its conjunction with heaven, particularly through the presence of God himself. So there's no need for a sun or moon because God's presence is there and he is light. And so, it is this tantalizing little thing that Matthew alone calls this the Genesis again. And I'm actually, this coming Sunday, I'm preaching on the Lucan version. We're preaching through Luke, and it doesn't have that word. This is a Matthean, this is Matthean kind of connection to his whole Genesis theme. But I don't know, maybe you want to ask something more specific about that, but
how would you explain to us the way Matthew can help us to bring together these concepts of creation and new creation? How would you help us see what Matthew does to fuse those two perspectives?
He certainly doesn't give us a full picture. I mean, we'd have to look at the eschatological texts of, say, well, some of the hints of it in the parables in chapter 13, and then, of course, Matthew's Olivet Discourse in chapters 24 and 25. But even then, there isn't really a lot of description of what it's going to be like. I mean, you really do have to piecemeal together a number of comments from other epistles, in the book of Revelation obviously has the fullest kind of picture with all its poetic imagery. I think this taps into a much larger issue of that Matthew cares a lot about, and that is, what is the relationship of Israel to the church, which I'm not going to be able to solve in a 2-minute, kind of thing here, or attempt to. But the fact that you have 12 thrones is obviously not an accident. That just as you have 12 disciples and a million other very intentional figural connections, 40 days, and nights in the wilderness compared to the 40 years. Jesus' double wilderness feeding and water crossings in chapters 14 and 15 are clearly Exodus. So you have all these Old Testament mimetic stories being used mimetically. They're being brought up again figuratively and connected. And so too there with the disciples sitting on 12 thrones. So ruling over Israel, it even says. And so, that's obviously not a full eschatological picture, but I think it does speak to the nuanced way in which Matthew continually affirms that, as he says in 5:17, I've not come to abolish the law, but I have to come to fulfill. And that indicates both a continuity and a discontinuity at a fundamental level. I think the continuity between what God has done in the past and what he's doing in Christ is that God has not changed, and the fundamental morality and the fundamental way that what it means to do the will of God and to relate to others as love of God and love of neighbor, that's consistent. There's no difference, I think, between the Old and New Testament. The New Testament and the New Covenant is emphasizing that the covenant is now not based on ethnicity, but based on all people welcome, no longer Jew or Greek, male or female, etc. I think that 12 thrones ruling over, and notice that it's not the 12 patriarchs, it's now the 12 disciples, which taps into, in Matthew, some of these other really important heaven and earth texts, Matthew 16 with Peter, and then Matthew 18 with the church, that the place of God's authority on the earth is not any longer the Sanhedrin or the temple, according to the New Testament. It's actually the Ecclesia to Christou. It's the church of Christ's disciples who have the authority to bind and loosen, that is, to declare what is right and wrong and declare who is right and wrong. You see the same thing in John chapter 20 when Jesus breathes the Spirit on them, language very reminiscent of Matthew 18. Go and forgive people's sins. And, I could say that as a low church Baptist, I think there's a way to understand that. That's not purely ex cathedra, Catholic way, as much as I respect that. But it's, even within kind of a more Baptist ecclesiology, to understand the power, the authority of God on earth is through the church. So, that's not an entirely cosmological or eschatological cosmology view, but it is related to this very nuanced work that Matthew's doing of both continuity between what he's done in the past and discontinuity. But he doesn't unpack it much more than that. So again, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Some of our listeners might not have thought fully through how Christ appears at the nexus of this relationship between creation and new creation. Jumping off this point about eschatology, the palingenesia, the renewal of all things, is there a sense in which the renewal of creation, in some sense, is already underway with the fact that Christ, according to Matthew, has arrived and is here bringing a new reality?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, of course, I do think that. And I think it's hinted at in Matthew. God's authority on earth is now through the disciples of Jesus, who are connecting heaven and earth really by what they bind and loosen. I mean, that's God's authority, his presence. Jesus was that, and now by the Spirit, the Church of Christ is that in the world. But I don't think Matthew develops that a lot,
Mm,
honestly. I think it's there implicitly with the authority. You see it also in Matthew chapter 10, where the disciples are his witnesses in the world as they are in the Great Commission. And whoever receives the disciples receives God, and whoever doesn't.
mm,
So that's, I think it's implicitly there, but I think, you know, I think you do have to kind of go to the other parts of the New
mm,
Testament. And I think where you find that talked about, especially is in Paul and the Spirit, which doesn't have a lot of airtime in Matthew, to be honest with you. And I can come back to why I think that is. But
mhm,
in Paul, especially, I think you see this. The Spirit is the space and place and the means by which the new creation is at work now.
mm,
So, famously, Paul says, 2 Corinthians 5:17, I think it is, if anyone is in Christ, new creation. I mean,
mm,
that's
mm,
Dianesis, it's like this is a pretty fundamental New Testament understanding that the new creation is actually being worked out
mm,
in and through us, but as we await for a consummation of it returning. Again, Matthew just doesn't do a lot with that. My opinion on why that is, and I actually was facing this recently because last year I wrote a little essay on the Trinity in the New Testament, and I wrote the Matthew one. And so it was really interesting. It was work I did actually several years ago on Father, Son, and Spirit in Matthew. What's up with that? I mean, like what appearances they make? And the Spirit was more there than I thought, but still it's not a very heavy pneumatology, especially compared to Luke or John, where you have a lot more Holy Spirit. So I think the reason is, my hot take on it is that there are kind of two traditions coming out of of Second Temple Judaism. One talks about the new creation era as a time of wisdom,
mm,
when Torah, that is God's law or will manifested, and wisdom are seen to be something that the people of the new creation era are imbibing and practicing.
mm,
There's another tradition coming out of Second Temple Judaism, not in conflict with that, but just another metaphor. And that is that the new creation era is the era of the Spirit, where the Spirit is writing the law on the hearts and the Spirit is empowering people. I think the New Testament manifests a way to think about Christianity with both of those traditions. I think Matthew, James, Hebrews, to some degree, First Peter, think of Jesus in terms of wisdom, and that the new creation people are people who are partaking in the wisdom of God and flourishing as a result. I think the Pauline tradition, and John to some degree, talks about the new creation as the time of the Spirit. And so
mm,
again, those are not in competition with each other,
mm, mm,
or different metaphors. And
mm,
when you combine them, you get a fuller image, but I don't think you get as much of that explicitly in the kind of wisdom tradition as the
mm,
Spirit part. So
mm.
curious what you think about that.
But it sounds as if, from what you're saying, that through entering into a relationship with God through Christ, believers get to sort of plant one foot in some of the realities of the new creation ahead of time, as it were, and
Yeah.
experience a foretaste in different ways.
By living with wisdom, I think,
Yeah.
especially according to how Matthew, James, and Hebrews talk about it. Yeah,
Mm,
which is in us in the
yeah.
new era. Yeah.
Yes. We're drawing near to a close here, but is there anything, looking back at that work you did in 2008 and when you were thinking more about creation and cosmology regarding
Yeah.
Matthew, is there anything that's changed in your thinking in relation to those topics, or that you would say differently or anything like that?
Yeah, I was very happy when I went back and reread this essay from many years ago that I didn't hate it. Little, there could have been a few things I understand more, but at least I didn't disagree with it, thankfully. Yeah, nothing really has changed. I mean, I feel like I've come to know Matthew a lot more. I'm very thankful, but on this kind of fundamental heaven and earth idea,
Mm,
I think it seemed to have proven true. Maybe it's just, confirmation bias. So I just believe in myself more or something. But as I've continued to study Matthew, it seems to come true. What comes to mind, though, is that a couple of different PhD students of mine have taken the Heaven and Earth book that I wrote first, and then this kind of essay, and have done some further interesting work. One of my earlier PhD students published in the same series, actually, Patrick Schreiner, used spatiality and like the idea of first, second, and third space, which some of our hearers may be familiar with. There's a whole philosophy of what space, not as that is outer space, but like place is. And it has a big impact on like urban planning. And so it actually relates to caring for creation very much. But what third space is this idea of like metaphorical spaces that are imbued with certain significance. What Patrick's excellent dissertation takes the heaven and earth ideas that I argued and then intersects it with this idea of spatiality to argue that Jesus's body is this third space that connects heaven and earth. So it's very interesting. He did a really good job on that. It's again a published dissertation. Another student of mine did work on the heaven and earth language and connected it more to the Old Testament idea of witness, and that heaven and earth are called as witnesses to testify. I guess I should have said this, sorry. Heaven and earth language, the other place it occurs in Matthew is in heaven and earth will not pass away. And then the question is, when does heaven and earth pass away? I think in some sense it passed away at Jesus' death, because in creation, and there's a future sense as well, where things changed. There was earthquake, there was darkness followed by light, tombs cracking open, dead people becoming alive. That I think that happens at Jesus' death and resurrection, and then will of course occur again.
It's clear, Matthew can't do everything that needs to be done or say everything that needs to be said about creation in the New Testament, but gives us a sense of why each of our biblical books has something unique to say and contribute to this as well as other doctrines. So thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan. We appreciate the opportunity to tap into your expertise and particularly your favourite book of Matthew. Your contribution is much appreciated for taking time out of your schedule and letting us tap into your mind. It's been very stimulating, I think. So thank you very much.
I'm honored to be part of this. Thank you so much.